Hello again. All right, so far we've been talking about what permaculture is and does, and we've been talking about different ways to get started with permaculture. But we haven't really talked specifically about site selection. So you always hear me saying, start where you are now. It doesn't matter if you rent or own. Just do permaculture wherever you are, whatever site you have access to. Just jump in and start interacting with the plants and interacting with the systems and experimenting with cause and effect, and you're going to learn, and you're going to open up doors in your mind that reveal opportunities that you didn't see before you started. So don't wait to start. However, if you do find yourself in a position where you have any choices at all about where you live or about the site that you select, then that's what I would like to discuss now. What are the things to consider if you're looking for a place to rent, even if it's only short term, or especially if you're looking for a place to buy where you think you might live there for the rest of your life or for a large chunk of time, and you want to do permaculture, a long-term whole system design there, then site selection becomes a really important part of the process. So when I think about site selection, so me, I'm a renter. I tend to rent, and I always rent, and when I'm renting a new place, I've lived in like 100 houses in my life, and I'm always doing this site selection process. I'm looking at my options. I'm engaging in this process as I'm talking to the potential landlord. I'm not just thinking about them. I'm not just thinking about the cost or the duration or whether or not I like the house. I'm thinking about the site itself and what sorts of systems are there, and what are the inhabitants, what are the ecosystems that are there before I came, and how can I contribute, and how can it contribute to what I want. And when I brainstorm about site selection, the mind map that I come up with is sort of has 7 main points. And the first one is what's your purpose or your goals or your motivations. The second one is what do you have access to immediately now? What's your access to land situation like? And can you use permaculture ideas? Can you use your creativity to gain better access to a site that's more suited to your goals and your purpose? And then, of course, water is absolutely essential. You can try to practice permaculture on a site that has no water. I choose to access places that do have water so that I can participate in the stewardship of that water source. And then species and inhabitants, like who else is already there. As I said, there's no such thing as a blank slate. There's always something else that's already been going on, even just on a molecular level. So it's good to sort of tune into that while you're thinking about choosing a site. What are the relationships and systems in place, and what are the structures in place? The house, of course, and the fencing, and the actual physical structures, but also maybe what are some of the cultural and emotional structures with the neighbors and with the community there. And then, of course, where's the waste? What's going to waste already? What's going to waste in the neighborhood? Where are the cycles and opportunities that you can see immediately? Those are going to yield some really important points in your decision-making process. So for the rest of this video, I'd like to just sort of circle back to these and touch on these points a little bit more deeply. So let's talk about purpose. So we're going to talk about this a lot, and this is really the first step in the Go Redeem design process that I'm always using for permaculture students. Is what do you need? What are your goals? What do you want? And why are you doing this? What's the point for you? What's your motivation here? It's really important to ask yourself these questions and to sit down and ask yourself what types of problems you're trying to solve with this permaculture project. That should have a bearing on which site you choose. So even if you don't really know why you're doing it, then that randomness can also influence your decision, and at least now you know that you don't really know why you're doing it. So sit down and ask yourself these questions, and ask your fellow stakeholders these questions. The people who are going to be doing the work on the site should be the first people that you talk to about this. And the stakeholders have the potential to make it amazing, and they also have the potential to ruin it. But first, just get clear on your purpose and your principles. Why are you here? What are you trying to do? What's your point with this? And then that, of course, is going to bring you into those permaculture ethics: earth care, people care, fair share, future care, paying it forward, limiting your consumption. This is the third ethic, of course, has lots of definitions. But as you're thinking about your goals and your purpose, then you're going to have that ethical conversation with yourself. And the reason we're calling it permaculture is because we're assuming that there's some sort of ecological ethic involved. So the next thing is access to land. And, of course, we can get into all sorts of conversations here about class and politics and privilege and how much access do different people have compared to how much access other people have. And, of course, that's part of this conversation. But the more creative you are, no matter what situation you're in, the more creative you are, the better access you're going to have. And if you make really good use of what you do have access to, I have found that access to more opens up. If you take a tiny abandoned lot in your neighborhood and you turn it into a beautiful garden, next thing you know, more people are going to be offering you space. So that's a really important part of this to think about. But for now, what do you have access to? And access comes through observation. So you can literally just walk around your neighborhood or walk around your house and realize that you do have some space that you could learn in and experiment with. So this also has to do with the multiple types of currency and exchanges in a non-capitalist approach. So it's not just about money and land, but what sort of social capital do you have? What sorts of communities do you have access to? Who might be involved? What sorts of information and tools and extra plants do you have access to? So this all comes into, as you're choosing your site, think about access in all of these different ways and think about how you can use your permaculture mindset to increase access for yourself and others. So the next thing to consider when you're thinking about site selection and selecting a site for your permaculture project is the water. Of course, you wouldn't want to move into a house where there was no water at all. And obviously there are a lot of people in the world who are living without water, and if that's the situation that you're in, then you use permaculture to help you figure out how to design around that. And as the world changes, many, many billions of people, I think, are going to find themselves in this situation. So it makes sense to learn that. However, you want to know what you're getting into, and water is one of the most important things to consider when you're selecting a site. You want to think about not just where the water comes from, but where it goes. Think about it from source to sink. Look for opportunities to divert the water between the source and the sink. Look for places to get water for free. Look for places to catch and store water. How does moisture in general as an element affect the site? How does dryness affect the site? Really look through the eyes of a water nymph as you're considering where and what you're going to do. That brings us to species, inhabitants, stakeholders, once again. So often when you hear the word stakeholders and you learn what it means, you think about it as the people on site. But what I'm really asking you to do, and what permaculture asks you to do, is to consider all of the non-human stakeholders on site as well. What plants are already there? What bugs are already there? What microorganisms are there? What larger animals pass through? What birds come through on a migratory basis? Really try to see that. And we revisit this when we get into site assessment and when we really get into the design process. We're constantly interacting with these other species. But as you're choosing a site, remember that there's no such thing as a blank slate. There's always somebody who was there before you. What are their needs? How could your ideas potentially really mess with their goals and purpose and motivation? So think about that, and how can those relationships unfold? And of course that takes us directly to relationships, which is the core of permaculture. Boundaries, relationships, mapping. Maps are boundaries, are relationships. Relationships or boundaries or maps are permaculture. It's all completely interconnected. A system is just a bunch of relationships connected together. When you're thinking about where you're going to be and where you're going to live and where you're going to be an ecological designer and a participant in the system, look at who lives there, what sorts of relationships are already happening, how can you participate in those relationships in a mutually beneficial way. What's thriving, how can you help it, how can it help you thrive, what's struggling, how can you help it, how can it help you alleviate your struggles. So this is the lens. Imagine if every place you'd ever rented or bought or lived or gone to, if you thought about it ahead of time through this lens, how would that situation have been different for you, perhaps more productive, and how would you perhaps be closer now to this fantasy permaculture ideal that we think about and talk about. And then the other thing about relationships to consider as you're looking and learning and observing is, are those relationships going to be negotiable or not? Are the boundaries negotiable? Where are the edges? And in permaculture, often we say the edge is where the action is. Everywhere where there's conflict and intersection is potential for productivity and synergy. So where's the friction, and how can you channel that to be a beautiful, positive thing for your project? So that's something else to think about when you're considering site selection and thinking about where you want to be. And then that brings us to structures. And when we think about structures, more often than not, we think about the house, right? The house, the fence, the steps, the railway, all the different things. And when you're looking for microclimates, when you're looking for ways to build the non-gardening parts of a permaculture system, and you want to create a hot microclimate so that you can grow, maybe it connects to the gardening part, right? Let's say you want to grow figs in a marginal climate and you want to plant them up against a white wall so that the heat reflects off of the wall and keeps the fig from freezing in the winter. So this is a place where the garden and the structures meet. It's where the garden and the house meets in this situation, or the garden and the greenhouse, or the garden and the garage, depending on what you have. And where those structures are is where you're going to find edges, and it's where you're going to find opportunities. It's where you're going to find conflicts, and it's also where you might find little eddies and little places where the energy has gone stagnant. So when you're thinking about structures, don't just think about the physical structures and the built environment, the human-made structures, but also think about the cultural structures. I guess those could be human-made as well. But think about the invisible structures, not just the visible structures, and also look for the non-human structures. What's the bigger picture here, and how are you a part of it? So I'm using the word structures very broadly here because there are so many different types of structures that you're going to interact with when you're thinking about this. And this ties back into the different types of resources. There's social structures, and there's economic structures, and there's biological structures, and there's physical structures, just like there are all those different kinds of resources and opportunities. So structures is a big part of it. And then obviously if you're renting or buying, you're going to be looking at the actual house. And I want you to also think about, how does that house itself connect to the garden? How could it connect? What sorts of ideas do you have in regards to the house as a structure, not just as a house? So there's lots of ways to think about this and to look at this. But these are the things going through my mind in the site selection process. And then the last thing to look for, well, of course, it's not the last thing. I mean, this isn't an end-all, be-all. I'm not your guru. I don't know all the rules here. But the last thing on my brainstorm list, the last really big important area I would make sure that you look for is the waste cycles. So not just where does the trash go and where does it come from, that's important, but what's going to waste? What are some spaces that aren't currently being put into play? If you're looking at the built environment, what sorts of spaces feel like a waste? What would go to waste for you? Which of your ideas wouldn't you be able to put into play on this site? Where is the surplus? Look for stagnation. Sometimes, like a big old pile of junk, which might at first glance seem like an eyesore in a potential rental, is actually full of resources that you could use for your project. That resources that you might end up needing to source or buy somehow if that pile of waste wasn't there. So this is a really good lens through which to consider your potential site. And then also, while we're talking about waste, I want to assert that fantasy, that waiting for your ideal site leads to waste. It's a waste of your energy. Really, you should be practicing, not fantasizing. And you're going to get closer to that ideal site. You're going to get there sooner if you drop the fantasy and start focusing on what's in front of you and just focus on making it amazing, making it beautiful, bringing it into harmony with nature and with your ideals. So that's my little pep talk about that. And that circles us back to purpose and to always asking yourself this question: what problems are you trying to solve and why? And I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way to do it. I'm saying that these questions will help to motivate you and to help you to see opportunities where maybe you didn't see them before. And this whole time, remember, permaculture isn't just about gardening. Choosing the right site for your project isn't just about a spot where it seems like tomatoes would do really well. That is but one of many, many goals that you have. It's about looking at the whole system, just like when you design it, and thinking, can you put all of your ideas into play? And obviously you're going to come up with more ideas as time goes on, but I'm sure you already have some by now. So look at your potential site through these different lenses, and look at the site where you are now, especially if you feel like you're not in an ideal site now. Look at it through these lenses and realize that there's tons of potential and opportunity there. And if there's really big challenges that feel prohibitive, then consider that a design challenge and tackle that. It's quite fun. And worst case scenario is you won't pull it off. Big deal. We're here to experiment and to have fun and to be with the plants and to contribute, right? So all of this being said, back to where I started from, just start where you are now today. And if you're looking and thinking that you might not want to be living there a year from now, then you have that whole time to practice and to get better at this process. And so put yourself through, your homework is to go through the steps in the site selection process, just kind of looking around your neighborhood and looking at your house and see if that helps to reveal some ideas for you. And in the next class, we will talk about site assessment. So there's some crossover here, right? We've already been assessing the site, but there's another layer to it. Once you've said, okay, this is the place I'm going to work, I'm going to create a whole system design here, I'm going to create a permaculture here, then now there's another layer of site assessment and observation that we'll jump into. So that can be super, super fun. We'll be reading the land in our next class and talking about reading the people as well. So see you in there.